Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the owner and founder of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and if you receive a lot of value from this video, please like, share, subscribe to our channel, and please visit www.personaldevelopmentschool for more videos, online training, online classes, courses, and in-person classes and courses. So today, this is part of the attachment series, and we're going to talk a little bit about anxious attachment types. And this is a fantastic video and way of educating yourself if you are either an anxious attachment style person in relationships, or if you're with somebody who is, or have a close friend or family member who is, because it will help to gain a little bit of insight into this person's mind and programming and subconscious patterns, and have a little bit more empathy and compassion, because our attachment style is something we develop at a very young age, and without the proper tools and realizations and knowledge, it can be really challenging to break out of these programs because they're so deeply embedded in our subconscious. So the anxious attachment person is somebody who in childhood who basically had a really strong incongruency around their parents meeting their needs. So they would have felt this inconsistency where the parents would sort of range from being really good at being physically and or emotionally present, and then being completely unpresent in one of these categories or areas. And so what this did, because this consistency of the lack of presence and the incongruency of presence was never quite enough for the child to completely break off from assuming their caregivers would meet their needs, they instead basically became hypersensitive as a coping mechanism. So imagine there's this child and they see this incongruency, but this incongruency doesn't quite give enough emotional intensity for the little child to go, okay, well, I have to start just rejecting my caregiver and meeting my own needs and learning how to self-soothe. So instead I just become hyper attuned to what my caregiver is going to do. Are they going to meet my needs or are they not? And there's sort of this like incessant questioning and fear of rejection and abandonment. And there's also a hypersensitivity and attunement that anxious attachment types also usually sort of have as a gift in a way to tap in and tune into other people's emotions. And that can be wonderful in many ways, and then it can also be challenging in many ways as well, especially when the anxious attachment style comes with a lot of other challenges, let's say. So there was this incessant fear basically for the anxious attachment child when it came to their caregivers rejecting them or not being consistent. And anxious attachment people basically suffer a lot from a high level of anxiety in relationships, often projecting a likelihood of rejection and abandonment, and then just fearing this really strongly. And again, anxious attachment types tend to be hyper attuned to meeting their partner's needs because of that hypersensitivity. Like when you sort of fast forward into adult life, they'll be really anxious but also attuned at the same time, and they can be really good at sort of like the people-pleasing elements in relationships and meeting their partner's needs, but sometimes their needs sort of get shoved under the rug as a result of this because they're so focused on not being rejected or abandoned that they kind of reject and abandon themselves in the process of just trying to please somebody and make sure the relationship is working and make sure everything's perfect and make sure they're showing up 150%, because if they don't, they might get rejected or abandoned. And there's that sort of underlying incessant fear there. So they will sort of hold the unconscious expectation because they're so like this. Their partner will do the same. Like, hey, I'm meeting your needs so much. You should be meeting mine, of course. Because we tend to project onto people from our realities, like what our expectations are. So what this means is they often set themselves up for disappointment because, the anxious attachment person is so strong in that space that it can often be really challenging for another human being to be as good as they are at being so attuned to their needs, or to be as aware in that sense, or as hyper-focused, spending as much emotional energy in that space of trying to make the relationship perfect and make sure that things are really good. So Anxious attachment types are generally really poor self-soothers in relationships. And they have a really hard time sort of like going about their day and being happy if there's any sliver or sense of something unresolved in the relationship, any conflict or pain. And they're often the types who will call or text incessantly if they don't hear from you. So if you know somebody is doing this, or if you're doing this, this is why, this is where it's coming from. And they often worry things, they tell themselves stories like, oh my gosh, something bad happened. It can be even as extreme as like, my partner's 15 minutes late, they died, they're unsafe, they're in an accident. Like they'll have sort of these extreme stories, or just this general fear that you might abandon them. And they struggle to be alone, anxious attachment types, and they often gain feelings very quickly for people at the beginning of relationships. Like they'll infatuate really easily and quickly. And they will also often feel very easily rejected by their partners. Even if, let's say you're an anxious attachment type person, and let's say that you are, you come home and your partner's having a bad day. You're probably the type that will be like, oh my gosh, they're rejecting me, they're abandoning me, they're leaving, they're gonna reject me. Oh, I did something wrong. What did I do wrong? Oh, their feelings are changing. And it can be this really painful cycle, because seriously, your partner could really just be coming home and like having a bad day at work, and it has nothing to do with the relationship. But there will be this sort of unconscious coping mechanism in your brain that's there, or patterning in your brain that will naturally assume that. And again, this is because your brain is wired for survival, so your brain will naturally assume this, so it can then protect you from the likelihood or the chance of this happening. But that can just really cause a lot more pain down the line instead. So anxious attachment types also tend to push people away by overdoing it. They might, they'll often pre-reject themselves. So let's say let's say you're in the early stages of dating this attachment style. They might go, hey, would you like to hang out on Saturday? And I don't mind if you don't. I would completely understand. And you can ignore this message if you'd like to. It'll be sort of this, like, it's almost like they assume rejection enough, or they'll pre-reject themselves when they're reaching out. And it creates this sense of unease in people that aren't that style and that don't understand it, where it's sort of like, oh, you can sort of feel that insecurity. And sometimes that feeling of insecurity will push people away. And again, this is just because of core programming or patterning you're living with. And the core wounds or beliefs for the anxious attachment style are usually things like, I am unloved, I am rejected, I am not good enough, I am unimportant, or I don't matter. And again, because of the perception that, you could be not good enough or unloved, the coping mechanism will also be that this style of attachment will go to great lengths to control their partner's feelings and even overcompensate, basically as a subconscious mechanism to avoid experiencing pain. So how do you work through this? Well, there's a few core things that you can do that will create a really strong impact. So number one, you can reprogram those core wounds. So you can ask yourself to find your core wound. What is the worst thing that a person can do to me in a relationship? And try to find a few of them. Don't just look for one. And that might be reject me, leave me, make me feel unimportant or small, not love me, and write those things down. And then find the opposite of that. So people will stay, people will love me, people will accept me, people will make me feel important or special, people will respect me and think I'm good enough. And because the subconscious mind is programmed through repetition plus emotion, the best thing you can do ever is to take those statements and every morning or evening, especially the first hour when you wake up or last hour before you go to bed, because these are the times of day that you're most suggestible, essentially, like your brain is most open to suggestion, your subconscious mind is, write 10 or 15 reasons why people will stay. And this can be like reasons about you, like they'll stay because I'm a loving person, they'll stay because I make people laugh, they'll stay because, and write all those things. But make sure you put that proof and make sure you feel the emotions, because sometimes we'll talk about affirmations and people will use affirmations and that's really fantastic and a step in the right direction. But, if I come, let's pretend, side note here, let's pretend that I go to a job interview and I say, I'm good enough, I'm good enough, I'm good enough. It doesn't mean the person's going to hire me. But if I go to the job interview and I say I'm good enough because I have this experience and I have this accomplishment and I have this education and I list these pieces of proof for why, now I'm selling the person. And our brain doesn't do so well when we have these really deeply embedded programs, when we just try to tell it things, because we'll sometimes just feel the opposite of those things, and the subconscious mind speaks more through emotion than language. So if I try to say nobody will leave me and I totally don't believe that, people will always stay, and I totally don't believe that, it's actually going to elicit this negative feeling, like even more fear of people leaving, and that feeling will always trump just the statement and the language, because the subconscious speaks so much more through emotion than through language. So sometimes affirmations can even like slightly push us away from our goal if we're too specific. So put either reasons for you with the pieces of proof, and that will be huge. Or even put pieces of proof for other people. Like, people, if you have a core wound around people always leave or people always reject you, look for people who have been in lasting relationships. Look at people who you know in society, or friends or family who have had really happy, positive relationships. And as you sort of put those pieces of proof down, you're selling your brain, which is really rewiring that program. And if you do that repetitively, because remember, the subconscious is programmed through repetition plus emotion. If you do that repetitively for 21 days, you will see massive results. It sounds like a small thing. It's arguably one of the best things you can do to reprogram core wounds, because we come into this world as this blank slate without these programs, and then we get these programs through repetition plus emotion, which means we can rewire them using that same process and those principles. So that's number one. Number two, when you feel pain in the moment, like when your partner is, let's say, coming home from work and is in a grumpy mood, and you start going, oh my gosh, it's about me, I did something wrong, question that. Can you know that you actually did something wrong? And question the person, hey, did I do anything wrong? Like, actually communicate instead of assuming and reacting to that emotionally based assumption. So learn to recognize your pain as sort of these alarm bells to wake you up, to let you know, hey, you're running this program again, and question the validity of that program, because a lot of the time that program will be invalid. And that will help you just sort of break free from some of those patterns that you're reliving. Number three, learn how to self-soothe. Anxious attachment types tend to struggle so much with self-soothing, self-nurturing, and self-love. And so practice setting daily rituals. And if you're worried about somebody and worried about them leaving or abandoning or whatever's going on, just practice like grounding yourself in that moment and connecting to yourself and nurturing yourself and questioning that assumption. And the more you're loving yourself, the more you have that sense of self, and the easier it becomes to self-soothe. And then you won't be so reliant on somebody to meet those needs emotionally and be running that cycle or pattern. So it's a very important piece. And last but not least, one other core tool is through exposure response, practice not overdoing it. So when you want to send that message that goes, hey, please hang out, but if you don't want to hang out, don't worry, that's okay. You can just ignore me too. When you feel the need to over-explain or overdo it, just stay calm. Just literally practice changing your behavioral pattern, because we have something called exposure response, which is a really good way of reprogramming actions, which is to just, in the moment that you're going to make one emotional decision and become conscious and make a different one, you can program that new pattern in. So practice just sitting and saying, hey, I would love to see you, and just shortening it, or whatever the context is, not calling 17 times or things like that, because that really does push people away. And look at what doing that actually costs you in the long run. So you can sort of balance out those positive to negative associations, where you have these positive associations thinking you're going to solve the problem and fix it, and then look at the negative associations. Like, how does that make somebody feel when you call them a million times? It makes them feel suffocated or trapped or afraid. So balance that out too, and that can be really fantastic. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video. Please ask any questions down below, like, share, subscribe to our channel, interact, connect, and please feel free to visit www.personaldevelopmentschool.com to learn about our online classes, courses, or anything we're doing in person. Thank you so much.